Oh, yes, sir.
All right, just waiting for it to load up to YouTube. A reminder to those who are tuning in that we will need to stop punctually at 8, if not a little earlier, because of the community Tisha B'Av service. Even though I don't have to travel, I do need to make sure I can move the computer from one room to another for the other service.
Rabbi, did we have the minyan? Did we get everybody, the 10 people?
For which minyan?
For tomorrow. For tomorrow's service.
Oh yes, I'm sure there's a minyan for tomorrow.
Okay, wonderful.
All right, that goes there. That comes up back here. Hey, Jose, good to see you. And screen share, that's the one.
Jose and Gina.
Oh, Gina too. Very nice. But I think their audio is still connecting. And I need that.
Jose and Gina.
And let's zoom in back to the top of the Mishnah. Oh, there we are. I think we can go a little bigger for people reading from the screen.
You know, Rabbi, since you introduced me into Sefaria, this thing is so addicting. It is fascinating. I can understand your passion for it.
It is an amazing resource. Once you click on one little corner, you just follow the threads throughout the rest of Jewish literature.
Amazing. Thank you for letting us know.
Oh, that's my job, is opening doors and letting people discover what's behind them.
Michelle, do you use it on your computer or tablet or phone?
I have a Google Chrome, so I use it there, like a little laptop.
Computer, yeah.
Chromebook, yeah. It works on the phone very well too. You can't open up as many layers at one time on the phone, but it's still very handy to have when you're out and just want to check something, or you're ending up waiting and you want to read. Especially because it downloads the text so you can use it offline.
It is so addicting, Rabbi, that when you start reading one, like if you go to the Tanakh and then you go into all the different Talmud, Mishnah, it is so addicting. You want to keep reading, and then you're fascinated because you learn more, and then I can't stop.
Or then to understand something, you have to go check somewhere else. Yes. And you check that, you need to do something else. Yeah.
Yes.
And
it is wonderful.
All just with a few clicks. It's the technology is amazing. And that they do this as a free service for the Jewish world is really just a great mitzvah.
Yeah,
and they started doing constitutional stuff too.
They began putting up some extra democracy links and things. Yes.
Oh, that seems like that'd be really hard to do on a large scale and make it, somewhat of the same audience, though.
Oh, did they?
I don't think they're trying to do it in terms of large scale. At least I don't know. Maybe they will. I think it was more of just a whetting the appetite of people to recognize some of the other foundational documents in our modern world.
Because they don't relate any of that stuff to anything in Jewish history, do they? The two don't relate, do they?
Well, Sefaria themselves, no, not as far as I know. I haven't actually looked into their democracy section lately, but there are many sheets made up by all the independent teachers who use Sefaria and save it on Sefaria that often do show linkages. I personally, the one thing I don't like about Sefaria is how you build a sheet, and I like doing that just in my own word processor. So I don't keep my sheets on Sefaria, but many other hundreds of people do. So if you go to browse the sheets and look up different topics, you can find a lot of already pre-curated information. So sometime later, just search democracy or constitution, and you'll find other people have already put together some of the information you're talking about. But we are on a bit of a schedule. Like I said, I need to finish by 8, if not a little earlier, depending upon where we are in our reading, because of the community Tisha B'Av. If you have not yet signed up, because it is a sign-up program in order to prevent Zoom vandalism, make sure that you go to the link that we sent out earlier today, earlier last week, and you can also find it on the Jewish Federation of Greater Orlando website. And thank you again for hosting.
By the way, someone tried to vandalize us on yesterday or Tuesday.
Oh, did they?
Yes. We were lucky that we catch him very fast and we mute him.
Right.
But they try. Yeah.
It is a shame. Yeah. People with nothing better to do. All right. So Eruvin, chapter 8. We are going to begin with number 1. The first 2 Mishnayot are kind of their own continuation of chapter 7. And then we're going to move back into the discussion that we sort of left off from chapter 7. So Mishnah 1 and 2 are dealing with the question of tehum, of the boundary beyond which you normally can't walk on Shabbat or around your city, and how you can make an eruv that would place that boundary further away, so that way you could journey a little bit further. And we'll talk about why you might do that in the very first Mishnah. So we're taking a quick break from discussing courtyards and alleyways to talk about the distance you walk, not carry, but walk beyond city limits. Everyone got the context? Good. How does one affect participation in connection with Shabbat limits? One sets down a jar and says, "Behold, this is for all the inhabitants of my town, for anyone who may desire to go to a house of mourning or to a house of feasting." So right away we see in this declaration the similarity to our courtyard eruv that we talked about before, which is that a person takes it, declares that it is available for others to participate in. Here he is extending it to the entire town. And you'll notice that it's explained that this is for a purpose, such as going to a house of mourning or going to a house of feasting. Remember, houses of feasting for a seudah, this is not just because you want to fill your stomach. Feasts in this case were feasts that were associated with a mitzvah. So you might have a brit milah, a circumcision, which has a feast. It might be part of the 7 days of the beginning of a couple together for their wedding, and you would be going to visit them on Shabbat during that week in order to offer your congratulations and to gladden them. So these are just 2 examples, but the Gemara makes it very clear, as does the Halakha, that this idea of extending the boundary was only meant to be used for the performance of a mitzvah. The mitzvahs go much wider than just, weddings and brit milah or paying respects to someone, to a family that has lost a loved one. It could be honoring your parents or such, but it's not just because you wanted to go walking on their boulevards. The extending of the eruv into another city or town that you would visit on Shabbat was meant to be done for a mitzvah purpose of one sort or another. Does that make sense? Okay. Anyone who accepted the eruv while it was still day is permitted, meaning to use it. But if one did after dusk, he is forbidden, since they do not set up an eruv after dusk, right? You can't make an eruv once it's actually become. And as we've talked about before, participation in an eruv is contingent upon the eruv being set at the time Shabbat begins. In this case, your participation comes in your recognition of it. Very interesting expansion of this idea in the Talmud, where they talk about the idea that the eruv only has to be known to you at the time that Shabbat begins. Even if you didn't formally accept it, as long as it was known to you, then the eruv is available to you. But you do have to be aware that the eruv had been made. If you find out that there's an eruv after Shabbat begins, that eruv does you no good. Yes, sir.
Just out of curiosity, before though, didn't we say you had to actually accept it in the when we were talking about the ones to move?
Right. So with regards to courtyards, where you're actually sharing your property rights, then there needs to be a stronger limitation on what can be expected of you, since after all, you're giving up ostensibly your rights within that courtyard. But here what we're talking about is the eruv is available should you want it. If you don't want it, you lose nothing by the fact that it's been created. And the rabbis are just giving an additional leniency in the Gemara and the Talmud to say, if you know about it, that is enough to make it eligible for you to then decide later that you would like to use it.
But what about the conditional Eruv that we talked about before? We said you could make a condition before it started, but you can't just change your mind or say, I want to, wait till it starts and then pick.
Right. You can make a conditional when you're making it yourself, because you are the one that is creating the Eruv. You're the one who is fashioning it. Whereas in this case, you're piggybacking on an Eruv that was made by someone else.
But I thought it had to be conditional before Shabbat started. I didn't think you could set one up on each side and after Shabbat say, I take that one.
Right, but in that case, you would be the one creating the Eruv. And so you have to actually make sure the Eruv has been created when Shabbat begins. In this case, the Eruv was definitely made. It's only a question of whether or not you, a third party, would be one of the participants in it.
So if somebody else, I guess, I don't know if you can create Eruvs for multiple people, but if someone else created an Eruv, you couldn't just say during Shabbat, I picked that as my home place?
So let me give you like a timeline, right? So on Friday afternoon, you find out that Bob has an Eruv to go visit a house of mourning, and Tom has an Eruv to go visit a house of feasting. And they're on opposite sides, directions from the town. And you find out about that. Now, Bob is bound to his Eruv for the house of mourning, and Tom is bound to his Eruv for the house of feasting. They don't get to change. They don't get to decide later. They're stuck, right? Because once you make an Eruv, you lose the distance on the opposite side. But Sam technically can choose a little bit later, as long as he knew that both of those had been created at the time that Shabbat began.
But he'll be losing his distance just like the other ones.
On the opposite side, he'll be losing his distance, or if he decides not to avail himself of either, he retains his normal distances all around the city. All right. So yeah, the novelty here is that we're dealing with a third party.
Rabbi, is this like a city that is walled in? Is that what we're thinking about?
Not necessarily. Any city has an edge. Well, back in the day before sprawling suburbs would go on for 20 miles, every city had an edge, beyond which there was a final house. And in previous chapters, we talked about how close the houses have to be to still be considered part of the town. But eventually you reach an edge, and that's where you draw your box around the city from the furthest point on all four sides. And then beyond that is where you add your additional 2,000 amot, 2,000 cubits for your distance that you could walk. And then this would add an additional element of additional distance by subtracting it from the opposite side.
Okay.
All right, Mishnah 2. What is the minimum measure for Shabbat border Eruvin, right? Here we're talking about food that has to be stored. Food for 2 meals for each person, for weekdays and not for Shabbat. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says for Shabbat and not for weekdays, and both intend to give a leniency. All right, so it gets a little bit complicated, but let me just back up and make sure everyone understands food on Shabbat versus food on a weekday. They are both looking at this and saying, how much food do you actually eat on a weekday? How much food do you eat on Shabbat? Now, on Shabbat, there's a reason why you might eat more on Shabbat for your 2 meals, because Shabbat food is generally better food. I know personally that when I sit down to Shabbat dinner, for example, I always have a larger dinner on Shabbat than I do on Wednesday or Monday. It's just Shabbat generally, miraculously, my wife seems to have a lot more and a lot tastier food. Not that the other food isn't tasty. And so I tend to eat more on Friday night.
But you have 3 meals on Shabbat also, when the rest of the day you have only 2.
Okay. On the other hand, Rabbi Yehuda is pointing out, but there are traditionally 3 meals on Shabbat, but only 2 meals on every other day. The modern idea of eating 3 meals every day is, well, modern. but in the ancient world, you would eat 2 meals on a regular day. And then on Shabbat, you would add your Seudah Shlishi. So the question from Rabbi Yehuda says, if I'm eating 2 meals that are Shabbat meals, those 2 meals might be smaller than the 3 meals that you're thinking of, right? Because again, in the days before the plenty that we often feel we have today, not everyone, but certainly a large majority in this country, your amount of food on a Friday or on a Shabbat in general may not be more than the amount of food you have for Thursday. Right? There's only so much food you can afford to buy. So that means for Shabbat, you would divide your food into 3 segments as opposed to dividing it into 2 segments. So that means Rabbi Yehuda is saying that if you measure it based off 2 Shabbat meals, those 2 Shabbat meals would be smaller than 2 weekday meals, right? As they would each be, it would be 2/3 of your food for a day rather than 1 full day's worth of food. Everyone following the math? Right? If you normally eat 3 meals on Shabbat and you need food for 2 meals for the Eruv, then if you measure your food based off Shabbat, then that means you take a day's worth of food and reduce it to 2/3. But if you were taking your measurement from a weekday meal, then your 2 weekday meals are equal to a full food for a day. And so those 2 meals would be larger than the 2 meals on Shabbat. Rabbi Meir has a different opinion. Rabbi Meir says, like me, that if I eat more on Shabbat for each meal than I do on a regular day, then that means the measure should be my weekday measure. Both of them are trying to make sure that the least amount of food necessary is what is required for making the Eruv. They are both trying to be lenient in this sense.
But that's also in a way to try to help economically to the community. They don't want to create and strangle everyone economically that is so difficult to fulfill the Shabbat because you need to have a lot of food.
Exactly right. Exactly right. The rabbis are very concerned about the cost of being Jewish, you might say. This is a common topic in the modern world as well. We don't measure it in food. We measure it in synagogue dues, in trips to Israel, in supporting Jewish causes, in educating your kids Jewishly, and having Jewish life cycle events. We have our own way of measuring the cost of Judaism. This was their way of measuring the cost of Judaism. And both rabbis, in their own way, are trying to keep the cost down on this point. Aaron.
Hey, a few Mishnahs ago, though, didn't they go into the exact amount of food necessary for an Eruv?
That was a different Eruv. Those were the Eruvs for the courtyards or for the alleyways.
Why is it a different amount of food for different Eruvs?
Well, because our sages want to make sure that we still have to do math.
Oh.
No, I mean, I've never seen personally an explanation that talks about exactly why the shiur, the measure, is different for one or the other. And I would hesitate to try and come up with one off the top of my head.
Because this whole time I thought it was the same Eruv serving a different purpose, but they're actually different Eruvs, huh? Right.
So the word Eruv is really like a mixture, an assembly, a conglomeration, right? It's a way of creating a conglomeration. Incorporation might be a good modern word. And there are different types of corporations, and there's different ways to incorporate. Just like in modern English, if you say I'm incorporating my company, it's very different than I'm incorporating my town. And the rules are very different, even though we use the same word. So there is a lot that is overlapped in the topic of Eruv, and there is a lot that is distinct depending upon which type.
Is there anything different besides the food or anything? Or that's...
Well, I mean, for example, the whole idea of having the portal, right? The markings of a door. You don't need to worry about the markings of your door for your Shabbat limit. The whole idea of, do you get to carry within this incorporation? If it's a alleyway or if it's a courtyard, yes, you can carry. the Shabbat limit incorporation, no, you don't get to carry.
Right. No,
And the fundamental halacha is different.
I knew they served a different purpose, but I mean, as far as setting them up.
Well, like I said, again, the physicality, the actual partitions needed, the boards, the distances, all the things that we've been talking about that are necessary to create either an alley or a courtyard eruv are completely irrelevant for the question of tehum, of traveling. Right? No one needs to set up a wall in order to then extend the travel distance. So in a way, it is much, much simpler than the other type. Now, we get into, for the rest of this, and I don't want to get into the weeds of the measurements because, well, it's complicated math because they didn't use the decimal system either. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka says, not less than a loaf that is purchased for a pondium when the price of wheat is 4 seah for a selah. Everyone got that? All right, so not less than a moderate loaf would be a way to translate that into English. If we were dealing in the modern world, not that this is the measure, but if we were dealing in the modern world and I said not less than a loaf of bread, the kind you find on the shelf in the bags when you go to the supermarket, right? All of those loaves are roughly the same weight. They're roughly the same size. They're more or less standardized. And that's kind of what he's saying, is there's a standard loaf, right? It doesn't have to be big, doesn't have to be small. And again, he's measuring through bread, which was the main foodstuff for the average person at the time, right? Most people didn't get a lot of meat, hardly at all. They might have a little vegetables, they might have a little fruit. Bread was the main thing. Rabbi Shimon says 2/3 of a loaf, where 3 loads are made from a kav of wheat. Half of this loaf is the size prescribed for a leprous house, and half of its half is the size that disqualifies one's body from eating truma. So I'm not going to get into the weights and measures here. It's fascinating if you're interested in that kind of thing. It's just confusing and irrelevant if you're not. But the one thing I do want to talk about is the person who has sara'at, this leprous house. Again, as people who study with me know, I hate the term leprosy because it is clearly not the medical condition often called leprosy, but that is the standard English translation for the affliction called tzara'at. And so we're kind of stuck with it in many translations. But when I say tzara'at, understand that's what I'm referring to. So there is a question in the Torah about when you go to a house that has this issue of tzara'at, this issue of affliction, and you eat in the house, that you become afflicted. But if you just walk into the house and leave, you do not. You do not contract the contamination. Terrible word in English, but you do not become tameh, ritually impure. And so the rabbis reason that therefore there is a minimum amount of time that is measured by eating that you could stay in the house. So it's not the eating per se, it is staying long enough to eat that makes it the measure. And the measure they come up with is this very small measure of bread. And saying if you stay long enough that a person could eat this much bread, then yes, you have become ritually impure, you become tameh. If you get out of there faster, it's not an issue. Okay.
At the end, who was right, Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Yehuda?
Well, in the end, they both are right in the sense that, and that's again why Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka comes in. They are both right in the sense that they are both trying to find a small measure, right? They're each talking about the same thing, but in different ways.
So, Rabbi, not to be off topic, but if you walk into a house and there's a dead person in there, and then you leave immediately, you're not ritually impure?
So a dead body is different than a house that has sara'at. The Torah talks about it differently. With regards to a dead body, right? When you regards to a dead body, no, a person who is in the same room with a person that is dead becomes tameh when they enter the room.
I forgot I said leprosy. Sorry.
Yep. That's okay. The laws of ritual purity are even more confusing than this. So it's very easy to get the different types mixed up. All right, we are on number 3. And we are now switching back to courtyards and their types of conglomeration, incorporation. If the tenants of a courtyard and the tenants of its gallery forgot and did not participate together in the Eruv. All right. Going back again into classic world architecture, you have the lower level of a particular courtyard, and you have separate property. They're not just, your upstairs renters. These are people who own that area up there, and there is a kind of shared balcony for the people who live at top. Right? It's not shared by the people who live below, just like the courtyard isn't shared for the people who live above. They each have their own space, even though they are physically connected, the buildings. If the people up above and the people down below didn't make an Eruv, right? They forgot, or for whatever reason they chose not to, they are considered to be separate domains with regards to carrying. So someone upstairs can't carry down, someone downstairs can't carry up. That is the general rule. Normally, of course, the ideal is that you would make an Eruv and avoid this problem. Right? That's why the rabbis have this whole Masechet of Eruvin. But if you didn't, you'd be separate. Now we have to figure out, how do we handle the in-between spaces? The spaces, the things that are sort of not quite on the bottom and not quite obviously in the top. The things that move between the two zones. Anything that is higher than 10 handbreadths belongs to the residents of the gallery. And anything lower belongs to the residents of the courtyard. We're not talking about possession. We're talking about availability for use during Shabbat. If it is more than approximately 30 inches, or a meter off the ground, it belongs to the people upstairs. It's their zone. And if it is beneath that, it is the lower residence zone. The rim around a cistern or a rock, if they are 10 handbreadths high, they belong to the gallery, meaning upstairs. But if lower, they belong to the courtyard, right? So same basic rule. To what does this apply? To one that is adjacent to the gallery, but one that is distant from it, even if it's 10 handbreadths high, belongs to the courtyard, right? So if there is a pillar that goes up and it is not close to the gallery, then technically that pillar belongs to the zone of the downstairs people. What counts as adjacent? What counts as near? One that is not further than 4 handbreadths, right? It has to be about a foot away or less from the gallery space to be considered the upstairs zone, to be included in their field of influence. Make sense?
I actually had a question. So when it talks about being far away, is it's talking about the object far away?
It's talking about the object that goes up is out of reach.
All right. So
out of reach technically. It doesn't matter whether you could reach it physically or not. We're not going to measure your arm. Instead, we're just going to say 4 handbreadths, that's your zone. More than that, it's not yours.
Is that what we went over with when we were talking about the balconies and being able to reach across? Is that similar?
No, that was like 2 completely separate balconies. This is like, think of like an apartment building where people own their apartments, not just rent. And think of the upstairs, how there is like a patio all around the upstairs zone. That's what it's talking about here. Okay. Mishnah 4. If one put his Eruv in a gatehouse, a portico, or a gallery, it is not a valid Eruv. So this is, where do you put the food or that's been set aside for the Eruv? If you put it in a gatehouse, a portico, or a gallery, it is not a valid Eruv. Why not? Because those are not actual residences. They are connected to, they are associated with residences, but they themselves are not residences. Gatehouse here is, think of it like the area where a person would stand to make sure that the people coming in and out are members or residents. Think like a modern gated community with a guard. The guard doesn't live in the gatehouse usually. They just come and take turns. these other zones are not actual domiciles. No one actually lives there. Even if they are inhabited at many times, they don't actually have a resident for them. And one who dwells in it, meaning if somebody does live in the gatehouse, portico, or gallery, does not prohibit, meaning even if for others from carrying, even if he doesn't participate in the eruv. I mean, it's not a sufficient enough residence for, even if there is a resident, for that resident to be a possible obstruction for the eruv. If one put his eruv in a straw shed, a cattle shed, a wood shed, or a storehouse, it is a valid eruv, right? Those are considered to be either extensions of or residences in themselves, and therefore, even though they're not a house, they do involve themselves in the eruv that you are dealing with. And one who dwells in it prohibits, meaning he can prohibit others from carrying if he doesn't participate in the eruv. Everyone follow that part before Rabbi Yehuda's little spin?
I was thinking a little, keep you thinking the previous one. And if you have an house with two stores, right? Okay, 2 floors, means you need to create a roof for the interior house?
No, if you have
two separate floors.
If you have a house that has 100 stories, you don't need an eruv at all. If you have 100 houses stacked on each other, meaning separate owned property, then to transfer from one private domain to the other private domain, you need to have an eruv.
So a building, you need an eruv from inside the building.
If the people actually own their spots. If it's like a hotel, I don't own my hotel room, right? I rent it, and the hotel owner is the one who owns it. And since it is all one person's property or one corporation's property, then I don't need to worry about carrying in the hotel. But if I'm in an apartment building where each tenant owns their apartment, then yes, there needs to be an eruv to take something from apartment 7 and to go to apartment 6.
So what happens if you have a building where each floor has only one flat, okay? And let's say that two of the people, 2 different floors, they are renting. They are tenants. You have, like, let's say, first and second are owner, third is rented, 4 is owner, 5th rented, 6 is owner. Okay.
Okay.
How can you create now the roof inside?
You make an agreement. Well, as we're going to see, renting is a bit of its own issue, but you basically make an agreement with whoever the true owners are. Now, let's get Rabbi Yehuda here, because this is the wrinkle. You're leading right up to it, right? If the householder, meaning the actual person who owns the building that the person is in, has there any ownership, the resident does not prohibit. So, for example, in a modern apartment building, and it's been a long time since I've been in an apartment, and even when I was too young to bother reading my lease completely. But imagine that the apartment building, you own the apartment, but you don't own the air conditioning system, right? So you own the walls, you own the floor, you own the ceiling, but you don't own the air conditioning, because that's part of the whole building superstructure. That means you don't own 100% of your apartment, the space, and therefore you, the current resident, cannot have an influence on the eruv. The person who owns the apartment, the rest of it, that is the person who has the say. Now, in the ancient world, it was a little bit less complicated, where it would be something like the owner of the apartment that you're renting, he might keep his extra jugs in the back room. And that means some of his property is still there. As long as some of his property is still there, then he's the one who actually is of importance when it comes to the eruv, not the current tenant.
So what happened today in a building where, let's say that everyone is owner, but not you don't have the full complete ownership of the building. For example, AC is a communal or whatever else, okay?
Right.
And the storage unit or whatever. What do you do in these cases?
So short answer, It doesn't matter because the way we make an Eruv nowadays has nothing to do with the courtyard Eruv. Long answer, I told you that we'll deal with how modern Eruvin are made when we get to the end.
Oh, okay, so building is the model.
Well, because we don't usually make an Eruv just for a building anymore, or even a courtyard. We make Eruvin for large sections of a city or a whole city, depending upon its size. And like we talked about with the alleyways before, once you've made an Eruv that includes the larger area, the subsets don't need to be covered. They are automatically covered by the larger Eruv. But we'll go into that in much more detail when we finally finish the whole Mishnah. All right, number 5. One who leaves his house and goes to spend Shabbat in another town, whether he was a Gentile or an Israelite, he prohibits, meaning the other residents, from using the Eruv, the words of Rabbi Meir. So even though I'm not home, Rabbi Meir is saying I still own the property. And that means without my participation, your Eruv doesn't work. Rabbi Meir loses, I should point out, just in case you're worried about this. Rabbi Yehuda,
sorry, Rabbi, we didn't learn that when you have a guest, you put extra food in the Eruv.
This is the other direction. This is the other direction. This isn't somebody coming into the Eruv. This is somebody not around to make the Eruv with you. Right? You're on vacation. And so when I knock on the door and say, hey, do you object to us making the Eruv? There's no answer. Do I make an Eruv for you, or can I include you in the Eruv or not? And if I can't include you, then your ownership of the courtyard, your share, cannot be assumed, and now we can't have an Eruv. That's Rabbi Meir's opinion.
Okay.
Rabbi Yehuda says the opposite. He does not prohibit, meaning if the guy's not there, it doesn't count as a home, right? An empty building is not a home. If you are away for 7 months, no one has to actually get your permission to make an Eruv. If you're there, then it matters, right? We're not making Eruvin for buildings, we're making Eruvin for people. No people equals no problem. Position makes some sense. He also loses. Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon are the ones who are going to win this argument. A Gentile prohibits, but an Israelite does not prohibit, because it is not usual for an Israelite to return on Shabbat. So Rabbi Yossi says, look, the problem is that if we just assume they're giving up their official ownership in order to have this incorporation, what happens if they show up and they object? And if it's a non-Jew, he argues, that's a real possibility, right? Because a non-Jew can travel on Shabbat, so his plane will arrive on Saturday and he'll be driving home, and we can't anticipate that because he's a non-Jew. He can do whatever he likes. And that means he could show up and say, hey, what are you doing? In which case, we would have usurped his authority inappropriately. But an actual Jewish person, well, Jewish people don't travel on Shabbat. If he's gone when Shabbat begins, we can rightfully assume that he is very unlikely to show up on Shabbat itself. And therefore, it's okay to use his share as part of this. Now, Rabbi Shimon gives a little bit of an example with this, and then I'll get to your question, Aaron. Rabbi Shimon says, even if he left his house and went to spend Shabbat with his daughter in the same town, he does not prohibit, since he turned his attention away. Meaning, even if you might worry that he's going to come walking back Saturday morning after having spent Shabbat evening with his family at his daughter's house, you don't really need to, because his attention is focused on that as being his residence. There's a very interesting issue that's brought up in the Talmud of why does it say spending time with his daughter? And the idea is, if he spends time with his daughter, he's reasonably confident he won't have an argument with his son-in-law that would send him walking home. But if he spends time with his son, there's a good chance he might have an argument with his daughter-in-law, at which point he's showing up again, and all of a sudden it could mess up the Eruv. So it's just interesting the way they thought which combinations could cause trouble. Aaron, question.
Yeah. Why is the Gentile so important? Because it's my understanding the Eruv has no effect on the Gentile. He can just decide to prohibit or accept the Israelites because he can carry whatever he wants anyways.
Absolutely. But he is still a property owner with property rights. The fact that he's not bound to the mitzvah of carrying and not carrying, or needs an Eruv or doesn't need an Eruv, is immaterial. The fact is we need his consent to create this incorporated shared space of the courtyard. And so therefore we need to be able to anticipate his participation or non-participation.
But why would you need to have consent from somebody about an Eruv when the Eruv does not apply to them?
Because officially the Eruv is giving you a share of his property ownership of the courtyard. I mean, it's like, you know, do you ask your neighbors if you can park in their driveway?
It's canceling the private property for one day.
Right. I mean, it's bending the rules of private property. Is, you know, it's a legal stretch in order to allow carrying, but the rabbis were concerned about the legality of it, that it might be only a legal stretch rather than an actual transfer of property rights that is any like more realistic. It's not like I can go to your house or to your part of the courtyard and say, hey, I own part of this, and start smashing it. But a non-Jew still has ownership rights, right? They still have rights in Judaism. Even if they do not exercise them at all in the same way we do, because they're not bound by the commandments, they still have rights. And even if we could say, ignore them, whatever they do, they don't care what we do, that wouldn't be a valid opinion, a valid point of view under Jewish law. We have to care about people, even if they don't care about our rules.
Hey, what about, didn't in one of the prior Mishnahs we say one can prohibit the other? Or I remember there's two people, and if one of them doesn't join, one's prohibited and one still can carry? How come?
Right, that was with an outer and an inner courtyard.
So they could, if he wasn't there, they'd have to basically put up hay around his portion?
It would get a lot trickier, exactly. Or like, you know, in most real cases, both in the ancient world as well as through the modern, when you're making an Eruv, you don't make it contingent upon weekly agreement among people. It becomes a semi-permanent thing rather than something that is being created sort of ad hoc every week. But this is trying to teach us what the rules would be if that's how you were doing it, not that you would actually be taking a poll. So you would get basically an agreement in your courtyard that would be, you know, standing for a year. It wouldn't be something that you'd have to renegotiate every week. All right, Mishnah 6. We got 15 minutes left. Not bad, not bad. I don't know if we're going to finish, but we'll get close at least. A cistern, right? The great world of the water pit. Right? This isn't necessarily a well. This is more like a large hole in which water is put and then water is taken out of. It's a tank. That's probably a good way of putting it. It's a water tank, but in the ground. A cistern between two courtyards. They did not fill up from it on Shabbat unless they made for it a partition 10 handbreadths high, whether above, below, or from its rim. All right, let me give you the basic visualization here. So imagine you have two courtyards, right? They are separate. There's a wall between them, but in the middle between them, there is this water tank. Well, water is water, right? Water doesn't stay in a neat stack like the hay that we talked about in previous Mishnayot, right? Water sloshes. On the other hand, the rabbis wanted to be lenient with regards to water because water is amorphous and water is absolutely necessary. So the question is, how can I put my bucket into the cistern and pull up water without taking your water from the other courtyard? What would they do? They would make a partition. They make a wall in the cistern. And the wall has to be 10 handbreadths high, meaning that our 30 inches, our 1 meter size, whether above, below, or from its rim, which basically means as long as, this is the way the halakha is eventually decided, as long as at least one handbreadth is either in the water or above the water, you're okay. If you build a wall that's down the middle of the cistern near the bottom, and you can just see the few inches poking out of the wall at the top, that's okay. On the other hand, if you build a wall that is sort of suspended from the top of the cistern going down, and it just dips into the water for just a few inches, even though we know the water underneath is mixing, that's okay. But there does need to be some symbolic partition of your side of the cistern and my side of the cistern. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, Beit Shammai says below, and Beit Hillel says above. So he's agreeing that this was the general position, but he said that Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai argued. The halacha eventually goes with neither of them, but with our first Tana, the anonymous voice, which says up or down, as long as it's 10 and a little bit in either, you're good. Rabbi Yehuda says, the partition could not be more effective than the wall between the two courtyards. He says, look, if there's a wall, and under the wall there is this cistern, this tank, why do you need a partition in the tank itself? The wall that goes above them. I remember a wall doesn't mean like giant stone blocks. A wall could just be like a wooden fence. Why isn't that good enough? Why do you need something that actually penetrates into the cistern? I should point out that he loses, but we're going to hear that opinion again and a rebuttal in the next Mishnah. Questions or comments on that?
How is it above? Is there, I guess there's a roof over the tank always, or?
Well, so it depends on how it would be designed. Some of them were covered, in which case there was a wall that went over the top of it. Some of them were more open, in which case they might just have like a fence that you would just, strap a couple boards that would go side to side over the gap, or maybe even with a post in the middle, but not penetrating into the water line. And he's saying a wall is good enough. Whatever a wall is, that as long as the courtyards are two courtyards, I don't care that there is this mixing of the cistern beneath them. But don't get attached to him, he loses. Because we move into our water channel. A water channel. So think of this like a gutter, or better than a gutter because you're getting water from it, like a little river, right? A little stream that's been directed into the town. And so it flows down, through the center of the town and through one courtyard into another courtyard into another. Everyone got the visualization? A water channel that passes through a courtyard, they do not draw water from there on Shabbat, unless they made for it a partition 10 handbreadths high at its entrance and exit. All right, so you have a little river coming through like a stone channel or something through your courtyard. It started in the other courtyard and it's going into another courtyard. When it's in your courtyard, it is not your property. It's actually technically considered a carmelit. It's considered to be of a sufficient size. If it's a tiny little one, they don't have to worry about it, but they consider this to be a sufficient size that it's its own zone, and therefore you can't pull from it. However, if you put a partition at the front or at the back, at the front and the back, not stopping the water, but being in the water to some degree, then you have demarcated that this portion of water is our property, and therefore I can draw from it and use it on Shabbat. Now, this portion of actual water molecules is moving and will be gone very, very soon. So it's not like the stones of my floor, which are there and stay there, but it is a sufficient enough statement of ownership and inclusion within your domain to allow the water to be taken from the channel, whatever water happens to be in there at the time you drop your bucket in. Rabbi Yehuda, again, he says the wall above it may be regarded as a partition. I mean, after all, this is coming like under the wall from the other courtyard. So there's already a wall above it. Why do I need a little partition in the water? Rabbi Yehuda said, it happened, right? I even have proof that I'm right. With the water channel of Avel, that they would draw water from it on Shabbat on the authority of the elders. I've seen people draw water from a water channel like this, and no one complained. They said to him, because it was not of the prescribed size. That was a small channel, just a few inches across. And that, yes, that is considered to be not its own domain, but to be part of whatever area it happens to be in as it goes along. But for a larger stream of water, that needs to be given its own partition, even if it might be considered symbolic as a way of saying this is separate from that. The water on this side is different than the water on that side. Questions, comments? All right, I think we can just sneak in one more water. And we got a lot more water to go, but this next water one, I think we can make it work before 8 o'clock. A balcony that was situated above the water. Now, in this case, we're dealing with, just imagine a house that is built out over a river, right? So your house is one domain, the river is a different domain. So how can you get water from the river to your house on Shabbat? Well, in general, you don't. A balcony that was situated above the water, they do not draw water from there on Shabbat, unless they made for it a partition 10 handbreadths high, either above or below. Now, there's a lot of argument about exactly how to visualize this, but basically what they're saying is that, I'll use sort of the majority opinion that I came across, is that if you build a little rim around the hole in your balcony through which you lower the bucket, and you build a little wall that's 30 inches up, a meter up, then you can drop your bucket through that hole and you can bring water up, and that hole is, that little wall is imagined to be like a tube that went all the way down. It's not a real tube, it's a symbolic tube, just by having that 10 handbreadths high, but that is sufficient to give you access to the water that is in the river below you. And if you make that above the floor of your balcony or below the floor of your balcony, or as some even argue, in the water itself and sticking up, and you're sort of aiming for it with your bucket, then that is okay, and you are allowed to draw the water up. Everyone got the visualization? So also, two balconies, right? Double-decker housing, one on top of the other. If they made a partition for the upper one, but not for the lower one, they are both prohibited until they make an eruv. So I make my little symbolic 1 meter tube, but the guy below me doesn't. I would be passing my bucket through his zone on my way down to the water below. Therefore, we would need to make an eruv in order for us to share the water that comes up and down, to link our two properties. And then the arrangement would be fine. I've always thought that Eruvin is just a really great way to get you to talk to your neighbors. Okay, so we're going to wrap it up there for tonight, just a few minutes early, in order to give everyone time to get set up for Tisha B'Av. Any other questions? All right.
Thank you, Rabbi. This is great.
Take care, everyone. Hope to see you in the community Tisha B'Av service at 8:30.
Yes,
Bye.
sir.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Yo quiero que estemos en Shishko Box, right?
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
You're welcome.